Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for your interest in this program. This is a fascinating program, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it very much. This program is the most complete course on Almarez and Guzman case decisions that you'll ever find in one location. I have 6 hours of review of precedent-setting cases that have employed alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman. And it's interesting, you may go to a QME Continuing Education Home Study live seminar, and you may have a speaker come up on the stage and present maybe 30, 45 minutes, maybe even an hour of philosophy on Almarez and Guzman before the next speaker takes the stage and discusses a whole different set of topics. Well, in this program, I have 6 hours of discussion for you where we go into great depth about precedent-setting cases that have employed alternative impairment ratings that have succeeded in effectively doubling, tripling, quadrupling, heptupling, decoupling, and even greater the impairment rating compared to the impairment rating that was provided under the strict application of the AMA guides. So in this program, we review several different categories of alternative impairment ratings. And I present to you several cases within each of those categories. So for example, in session number 1, we go over in great detail the Almarez and Guzman decisions, and we discuss how the Almarez and Guzman decisions fit into the context of existing law, which requires the use of the AMA guides in providing for permanent impairments. Then we talk about an entire session of permanent impairment analogies by use of what's known as the direct estimate method of rating permanent impairment. And you've probably heard of the direct estimate method of rating permanent impairment. Well, some cases that have employed the direct estimate method have succeeded, and unfortunately most of the cases that employ the direct estimate method do not succeed. And I show you the difference between success and failure when using the direct estimate method. In our next session, we go over many cases that employ alternative impairment ratings by analogy to gait disturbance and gait derangement in chapters 13, 15, and 17 of the AMA guides. And this is going to blow you away because I have several examples of cases that employed alternative impairment ratings by analogy to gait disturbance and gait derangement when the examinee had no actual gait derangement. The examinee had none of the components of gait derangement that are described in the definitions provided in chapters 13, 15, and 17, and yet the qualified or agreed medical evaluator was able to provide an analogy. An analogy. You see, it's an analogy. They provided an analogy to a person who had a gait derangement. And guess what? The judges and the triers of fact upheld these analogies based upon what I concluded to be quite frail support by the qualified or agreed medical evaluator. So I'll share those cases with you, which I'm sure you'll be fascinated by those cases. And actually, one of the cases, the Cannon case, has become a precedent-setting case. You'll see the Cannon case referred to in the cover letters that you receive from the parties. In our next session, we go over permanent impairment analogies by analogy to grip loss and loss of grip strength. And I have several cases to review with you that detail this type of an analogy. And like analogies to gait disturbance, it's fascinating. You can use an analogy to loss of grip strength even in examinees who have no injury to the hand, who have no injury to the wrist, who have no involvement of the hand or wrist. I have a case to share with you where the examinee suffered injury to both shoulders, bilateral shoulders, and the qualified medical evaluator rated the permanent impairment by analogy to loss of grip strength. And initially this was rejected by the workers' compensation judge, but on appeal, the appeals board upheld the qualified medical evaluator's opinion for permanent impairment by analogy to loss of grip strength. It's actually a quite fascinating and creative use of this analogy, and it opens the door to many, many possibilities for other analogies, even when the body part analogized to is not involved and is not in any way one of the accepted body parts. So I'm sure you'll find that to be quite fascinating as well. Then in our next session, we go into a discussion of adding versus combining the permanent impairments. And this is a particularly hot topic these days because, as you know, combining the impairments through the use of the combined values chart on page 604 always results in a reduction and a compressive effect on the final permanent impairment rating, whereas adding the impairments simply results in an additive, non-compressive totaling of multiple impairments. Well, it's through the use of adding the permanent impairments versus combining the permanent impairments that high final permanent impairment ratings, even permanent impairment ratings that exceed 100% impairment, are achieved. And this is how examinees are achieving a 100% disability status. See, through the use of the combined values chart, it's nearly impossible or even impossible to arrive at a 100% permanent impairment rating because of the compressive effect of the combined values chart. Well, through adding the impairments, we can easily arrive at final impairment ratings of 100%, 120%, 140%, and it's this adding of impairments that results in examinees who are receiving 100% or total disability awards. So adding versus combining impairments is a very powerful concept, especially in those cases that involve multiple body parts, multiple impairments, and high impairment ratings. Then in our next session, as if that wasn't enough, the creative analogies of alternative impairment ratings continue to flow unabated from qualified medical evaluators. And in our next session, we go over some cases that employ what's referred to as disregard of the cross usage chart. And this has to do with lower extremity injuries in Chapter 17. As you know, in Chapter 17, Table 17.2, known as the cross usage chart, tells us which impairments of the lower extremities can be combined and which impairments of the lower extremities are duplicative of each other and therefore cannot be combined. Well, in a creative use of Almarez and Guzman and alternative impairment ratings, it's possible, if you can explain it, if you can explain how and why, it's possible to disregard the instructions of the cross usage chart, and it's possible to combine impairments of the lower extremity that otherwise could not be combined under the strict application of the AMA guides. And again, like other alternative impairment methods and analogies, this results in a doubling, tripling, quadrupling, even a decoupling. 10 times is a decoupling, can result in a decoupling of the final impairment rating. So it's an extremely powerful alternative impairment rating method. And then finally, in this program, we go over several cases that represent the most creative applications that I've been able to uncover in existing cases, where qualified or agreed medical evaluators have really pulled out all the stops and gone over the top with creative impairment ratings that result in huge final permanent impairment ratings for examinees who otherwise would qualify for either no or very little permanent impairment under the strict application of the AMA guides. In fact, I have one case where the qualified medical evaluator made an analogy to headaches. And headaches ordinarily under Chapter 18 would qualify for very low, meaning 0 impairment, or perhaps as much as 3% impairment due to pain. But due to analogy to paroxysmal disorder, the medical evaluator analogized the headaches to what he referred to as a paroxysmal disorder, similar to epilepsy seizures. The impairment rating escalated from 0% under the strict application of the AMA guides to somewhere in the 30% whole person impairment, and that was just the beginning of the creative impairments employed in this particular case. And I have several cases in this final session that employ very creative alternative impairment ratings, which I'm sure will be very fascinating for you. So this is a fabulous program. You know, many times as qualified medical evaluators out in the field, we don't have access to actual cases. We don't have these databases, and we don't come across precedent-setting cases. Well, in this program, I've extracted approximately 20 precedent-setting cases in the Almarez and Guzman alternative impairment rating category of cases. So these are actual cases that show how the qualified or agreed medical evaluator arrived at the alternative impairment rating, what the trier of fact concluded regarding the alternative impairment rating, in other words, whether the alternative impairment rating succeeded or failed. And in those cases where the alternative impairment rating failed, I show you why it failed, and I show you what the decision on appeal was when the decision actually went to appeal, and I show you why and how this decision either succeeded or failed at appealed. So basically this course contains recipes, established recipes for employing alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman. And so I'm sure that you'll enjoy this program very much, and that you'll learn many, many things that you can apply to your very next case evaluation.